Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. I'm Pam Laricchia, longtime unschooling mom and author. Join me and my wonderful guests for interviews, information, and inspiration about unschooling and living joyfully with your family. You can find the episode show notes, your free introductory ebook, What is Unschooling, and lots more information at livingjoyfully.ca. And here's the show. Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Laricchia, and this is episode number 70 of the podcast. It's the 3rd of May, 2017, as I record this intro. Yeah, number 70. I think that's pretty cool. And this week, the book chat is back. In this episode, Emma Marie Forde and I chat about the book Rethinking Autism, Diagnosis, Identity, and Equality, edited by Katherine Runswick-Cole, Rebecca Mallett, and Sami Timimi. In this collection of essays, the author set out to challenge some of the ways in which autism is understood by looking through the lenses of the science of autism, the cultural life of autism, and the professional interventions or treatments of autism. They note that it is written in the spirit of openness, inquiry, and the desire to help improve people's lives. As I read it, I was really struck with the many parallels that I saw between their questioning of society's approach to children's behavior and unschooling parents' questioning of society's approach to children's learning. Emma and I really enjoyed diving in and pondering the many questions that the authors raised. As a personal update this week, I've been reading Deep Work by Cal Newport. I'm really enjoying it, especially the connections he makes between deep work, learning, and flow. Learning and flow are favorite topics of mine, and I intuitively connected them to the idea of deep work that I was envisioning before I started reading, so it was nice to see that the author makes those same connections as well. And this week we finalized plans for Lissy's visit home next month, and we're all really looking forward to that. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the show on Patreon. I really appreciate all of my patrons. You guys inspire me. And I love that you're helping me share unschooling information with anyone who wants to explore ways to live this wonderful lifestyle with their family. And now they've got 70 episodes that they can binge on. If you would like to support the show, even for as little as $1 a month, check out the Exploring Unschooling page at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/exploring unschooling. And this week's quote is from one of the essays, Understanding This Thing Called Autism, by Katherine Runswick-Cole. The contemporary cultural autism story told about people with the label drowns out all the other stories that could be told about them. Autism is a story, but it is not the story. I love that because people really are so much more than one story or than one dimension. Autism may be an aspect of a person, but it's never the whole definition. It's never their only story. As we talk about so often on this podcast, our children have their own unique interests and passions, strengths and weaknesses, sense of humor and perspective on the world. They are uniquely themselves, even if autism is also part of their story. And with that, let's get on to the book chat with Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Laricchia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Emma Marie Forde. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Pam.
Hi. It is so nice to have you back for another book chat. This time, Emma and I read Rethinking Autism, Diagnosis, Identity, and Equality. It's a collection of essays edited by Katherine Runswick-Cole, Rebecca Mallett, and Sami Timimi. The authors of the essays set out to challenge some of the ways in which autism is understood. So they were looking at the science of autism. They had a section on the cultural life of autism and the professional interventions and treatments of autism. They note in the introduction that it is written in the spirit of openness, inquiry, and the desire to help improve people's lives. And I love that they made a point to say that their essays are around challenging society's current construct of autism not about discounting the behaviors, experiences, and challenges of children and adults who may be labeled as such. It's about thinking or rethinking the framework of autism that society has placed around them. And it's about raising questions, about challenging that mainstream literature and conceptions of autism that they feel can both limit and damage lives. So I just wanted to say, when I started the book, it was challenging to get into because of the academic language that the essays are written in. It wasn't an easy read, certainly up front. But maybe really it's the writer in me who wanted to simplify their sentences to get their point across so much more clearly, because my mind kept translating what I was reading into my personal language. And there was a point where I actually highlighted one and I said, "What?" So I thought I'd read that. The sentence was, asking instead, what do we need to do to create the dialogical conditions which bring forth co-creative conversation, orientates the professional away from looking for evidence to experimenting with relational solutions. Or in my language, that was meet the child where they are and openly engage with them. But I definitely understood their intention was to challenge autism researchers, and that is the language that they speak. It's just been that it's been many years since I have been reading that language, so that was pretty funny. But by the end of the book, I was really struck by the many parallels that I saw between their questioning of society's approach to children's behavior and unschooling parents' questioning of society's approach to children's learning. So I really thought that was awesome. We are asking the same kinds of questions and always putting the children first. So what about you, Emma? What was your first impression?
Yeah, I mean, I must say I really enjoyed reading the book, and it was a real relief to read the experiences and ideas of people who were thinking critically about autism. And I felt the book really gave some validation to some of the troubling experiences and ideas that I'd had about autism, really, both in my clinical work and also in my personal experience. And the book, I felt, really articulates and elaborates on those. I felt the book provides the reader with a framework for thinking about the concept of autism, which doesn't involve pathologizing or seeing behaviours associated with autism as a biological difference or a disorder. So it's more about widening our conceptualization of what it means to be human and thinking critically about the process of labelling and diagnosis and the concept of autism itself. But I can understand what you said when you said it was sort of like a bit challenging to get into at first, because I think if you're new to some of the academic terms and the language used, it can be a little difficult. And I mean, I do come from a background in psychology and philosophy of science, but even saying that, like I've read the book through now for a second time, and I did have to really sort of like read through the chapters, and I was taking notes, and I probably will go back to it again because I think there are some quite complex ideas in there. And I think it's sort of challenging for sort of like a few reasons as well, because they are challenging ideas that they're sort of presenting. And I was going to say, I'd also read a book people might be interested in as well. It's called The Myth of Autism, Medicalising Men's and Boys' Social and Emotional Experiences, which was a book brought out in 2010 by Sami, Timimi, Brian McGabe and Neil Gardner. And that was quite an interesting introduction to the background of some of the work, and the book is drawn on in Rethinking, or the Rethinking Autism book. And and the two co-authors of that book are also men who've been diagnosed with autism, and they share their experiences of that, really, and the path that the struggles that they've had and the path that they've taken, reflecting on that. So it's really interesting to get those sort of different perspectives. I was going to say, I was really pleased the book has been written, because I think it gives voice to some of the tensions and conflicts which have come up quite frequently, I'd say, online in unschooling discussions about how we can really think about and understand children's behaviour. Autism is something that parents, they do want to address it in discussions, and often they're wondering if a diagnosis of autism could be helpful for their child, or they may have come, to the group already with a diagnosis and wanting to sort of share that and understand really what it means in terms of unschooling. And I think sometimes in the discussions in unschooling groups, I've come across sort of quite polarised positions on both sides. So sometimes, like an unschooling advocate might sort of say, we need to put labels aside, they're harmful. And on the other side, then you've got parents sort of saying, but hang on a minute, this diagnosis of autism has been really helpful to us as a family, and it's an important aspect of my sort of child's identity, and I really feel that it should be acknowledged and celebrated. So I think this is something that, like I say, it's a tension that I think sometimes comes up in online unschooling groups. And I think some of these conflicts are addressed in the book, in terms of thinking more about the relationship between autism and the impact of labelling and how that might play out. So, and I must sort of say that I've tended to come down on the side of setting labels aside and widening our conception of what it means to be human, rather than resorting to sort of diagnosis and labelling, because from my own sort of personal experience, I feel that can be limiting and constraining for the child. And I think with children, often their perspective and their voices aren't always taken into account. It's more difficult for them to be heard. And but I know that taking this perspective can sometimes leave parents sort of feeling disenfranchised and confused as to where they stand. And I've also found that people do find sort of letting go of the label can be difficult, and this is something that's sort of explored and by the authors in the book. I was going to say that sometimes it feels like the parents have invested sort of like time and effort, and sometimes like resources into pursuing a diagnosis, and so it's kind of become something that's important to them as a family. And I was interested to hear what your thoughts were about this, Pam.
I mean, I've had the same experiences, have seen the same kinds of discussions, and I find it really interesting, because I have personal experience in that area, in that my eldest, I've told this story before on the podcast, my eldest was going to school. He and school didn't mix very well. I didn't know about homeschooling. They wanted all sorts of labels, and there was just I found labels helpful in dealing with the schools, right? And in first finding out a bit more information, especially information in what they meant. There were tips about, ways I could help my child and everything. But even at that time, the information I was getting, I still, even when he was in school and they wanted all this, I was still always looking to my child. And I could see from the different doctors that we visited and the different labels they wanted to come up with that, there was no answer. Then that's in air quotes, but you can't see my fingers. So because you know what? I just posted something from the technology episode, that unschooling and critical thinking. I had this critical thinking going on at the time, while my son was in school, and things were just not jiving, between what they were saying and what I was seeing. Right now, the labels were useful for school, but they were always like the school language and the school things. And that's even how we talked about it at home, because I saw an awesome kid at home, so to me, that was a school issue, which was, of course, why I was so excited when I finally found out they didn't have to go to school, that they could stay home and he could just be himself. But there was a lot wrapped up with the labels, because that was the kind of language, like I said, this was the language I, kind of used to know, and that they used to talk to me in, and that kind of stuff. But I really found once I got home, I felt more comfortable because, that was always the expert. They were the experts, were they right? I was kind of worried. This is what I saw and this is what I believed and this is what I thought. But I was getting all this other, all these other conventional messages, whether they're the conventional messages about school or, the conventional medical messages about these issues. I still had to think for myself. And once we were home for a few months, really, I remember thinking, wow, I don't need that anymore. There is zero value to having those label conversations or to have that information there for me. So, I can totally understand people who are at a time in their family and their journey, and maybe it ends up being something that works for their family. That's just something else I was talking about in thinking critically, to be open to asking these questions and working through them and see what really does work for your family. And mostly at that point, when it's about a child, it's does this add value to the child? Is this something that's making them more comfortable? To know that there's other people who may be similar. You know what I mean? The challenge really comes if you start seeing your child through that framework, through those labels, and you start having expectations around it. Your child has to be able to be their child. And that was it with them and all the labels. He fit a little bit here and maybe a little bit here and maybe a little bit here. But that was the silly thing. It's like, well, if he can fit sort of all these different things, what real value is any one of them? Because it's not just one. You know what I mean? So that's where my experience with labels came in and how they ended up in our lives anyway, not really adding any value, certainly once we managed to get away from the school environment.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a bit on what you said, because I think I found as well that it was really nice to have a space within unschooling that was free from labels, that there wasn't a pressure there to sort of define behaviour in terms of, like a diagnosis, that you could be free to meet your children's needs where they were at. That's something that I found sort of quite special and unique about some of the spaces in the online groups that I came across. And I also really enjoyed reading Anne Oman's essay, which is I Am What I Am, because I felt that really encapsulates the approach that we take in unschooling, where we do see our children for who they are and we can just meet them where they're at. And we can just sort of respect them, as people. And that's something that I've really valued.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when she wrote that, I'm going to have to go check dates now, because I feel like I read that when I was first coming to unschooling. And so it really resonated with me as well, because, coming from that environment where the focus was so much on the labels and on getting services in the schools, and even some of the online groups I was involved in at that time, that was the focus, right? Because everybody needed that help and that support. But I read that, and really after a few months, weeks, I basically kind of left those groups, because that wasn't that was no value in our lives, because it was all about that school framework. So that was really interesting. Mm-hmm. So I thought we'd touch on the history of autism, because there were a number of essays around the history and the development of autism, and that a number of theories have risen and fallen out of favor. I found that really interesting, like the theory of mind, which is referring to the ability to understand that other people have their own plans, thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, and emotions, and that is the central deficit found in autism. Then there's the extreme male brain theory, and boys will be boys, and the notion that educational methods that are currently used in Western schools, like the continuous assessment and socially oriented worksheets, are favored more by girls than boys, and the medicalization of behaviors that lie outside and increasingly narrow norm of expectations. And then there's the theories around it being a biological problem with abnormalities in certain brain structures, problems with neurological connectivity, effects of vaccines, etc. Yet, as they outlined in the essay, does everybody with an autism diagnosis have the same underlying condition, which was written by Richard Hassel? No genetic or neurological basis for autism has so far been reliably established, despite extensive research studies conducted over a long period throughout the world. Now, he makes it a point to say that this does not mean that there's no such thing as autism. Those with the diagnosis generally do display significant disabilities of one sort or another, although there is wide variation in the nature and severity of these. That's the end of the quote. See, he's talking about how a single root cause has not been found. Now, there was an essay, Understanding This Thing Called Autism, by Katherine Runswick-Cole, that I really connected with. She's a senior research fellow in disability studies and psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University and the mother of two young adults, one of whom has been labeled with autism. And in that essay, she shares her journey. Her current view is that, quote, autism is a contemporary cultural phenomenon so that labeling people with it is no longer helpful. Now, I appreciated her touching on the ethics and challenges of being a mother researcher because she was in the middle of her psychology degree when her son was diagnosed. Then she dove into the autism literature, learning about autism and its cultures, eventually attending a support group for parents of autistic children, which, reminds me of Anne's I Am What I Am essay. Katherine describes how she was seduced by the autism culture and began to speak the language of autism and recognize behaviors. She began to spot autistic pathology in family members, including herself and her husband. And I remember that from our journey as well. Then she was introduced to the social model of disability, which sees disability as something imposed upon people as a result of social arrangements that oppress people with impairments, meaning that it was the systems, attitudes, and environments that disable people with autism. Then she came across a neurodiversity movement, arguing that autism is a naturally occurring brain, a brain that's different, not a disorder. And she came to see that for her, both the social model theory and the neurodiversity movement were limited by the fact that they still treated the construct of autism as a biological fact. So the quote, the stories of the medical world remain pervasive and powerful. They are the dominant meta-narratives in our contemporary culture, but they are just that, stories. So her experience is that the category of autism is of limited use to those diagnosed with it. Instead, her point is that autism is a contemporary cultural construct, quote, an all-encompassing label, a narrative lens that accounts for every aspect of my son's behavior and personality, so much so that there is nothing left of him that cannot be accounted for without reference to the autism story. She writes, autism is, we are told, the reason why our son liked Thomas the Tank Engine, why he now likes Star Wars, why he made up words as a young child, why he likes to play chess. This thing called autism is everywhere. It is embedded in contemporary culture. Popular magazines, newspapers, books, films, academic journal articles, and conferences that both describe and produce autism. We've also noticed that the number of children labeled with autism across the globe continues to rise as debates rage about whether it's better diagnosis or an increase in prevalence that's to blame. So her point is that the contemporary cultural autism story told about people with the label drowns out all other stories that could be told about them. Autism is a story, but it's not the story. So that was my experience as well that I was talking about earlier. When he was in school, that label was a shorthanded way to convey, some basic information and some expectations with teachers and school personnel. But I saw that label really did give them that tunnel vision. They saw everything about him through that. They felt that was all they needed to know about him. Yet, as I said, once they left school, within a few months, I saw that label didn't add any value to our lives or to his life, because I would get so much more information by looking at him rather than looking at the label or researching the label. because I knew what I needed to do was help him where he was. Not even have expectations of things that he would do because of that label. You know, all the different ways that you can frame it that way. I could see for myself what his strengths and his challenges were. I was there to help him, both to take advantage of the strengths that he had and support him more in depth with his challenges. He was his own unique person with so many different stories. He was so much more than that one story. So I was wondering, what about the history stood out for you, Emma?
I mean, I thought it was really interesting that, as you mentioned just then, that despite all of the research over the years and the huge amount of money really that's been invested in research looking for sort of underlying biological or genetic causation, that nothing, no biological markers have been found. And Sami, Timimi and Brian McGabe explore this more in a chapter in the book called "What Have We Learned from the Science of Autism?" And they sort of look in more depth at the history and the research. And also Nick Hodge, he sort of mentions that £21 million was spent in the UK between 2007 and 2011. And the majority of that money was spent on looking at neural and cognitive systems and genetics and other risk factors, but very little was actually of that money was actually spent on thinking about interventions or in terms of ways of improving people's lives, social interventions or things like that, which that's really struck me as quite a lot there. It's quite staggering really. The book, I guess it was just that it highlighted to me how the concept of autism really has become like a reified concept, and people that are diagnosed with it can have very different sort of presentations, and they can be quite different from each other really, and that in terms of the sort of scientific reliability and validity of the concept, and even sort of like in terms of the clinical utility of it, it isn't a particularly useful concept, but at the same time it's rarely questioned. People do generally still tend to believe, if you sort of speak about autism, that there is a biological cause has been found, and that's sort of quite a dominant story that I come across anyway. I thought it was an important point you made as well about us, that the book is really asking people to think critically about the concept of autism. They're not suggesting that families don't experience difficulties, or that children or adults might not might have ways of being that they might struggle with and that they might need support with. I think that's something really important to emphasize. But at the same time, they're really asking us to sort of go beyond our initial sort of conceptualization of those behaviours and to look in the wider context really. I thought that it was interesting how Katherine, you mentioned, how Katherine really explored her experience with her son being diagnosed with autism. I think that's a real sort of interesting position, and a lot of people I know that you can be both a professional and a parent of someone, of a child with autism, that it's not necessarily either or, that our sort of experiences can be sort of like interwoven, and that most people might know someone that has, received a diagnosis or may feel that they might qualify for a diagnosis in their lives. And I thought it was brave of Katherine really to speak about that as well. And I'm glad that she has. I also thought, I was just going to say actually that Katherine talks about her experience in more depth in a podcast by the Radical Therapist. And it was interesting to hear her speak about that in more detail. Yeah, no, it's really good. I recommend it. And I think it all led into me as well about thinking from an unschooling perspective about how it's helpful to not see your child through filters, or to try and see them without filters. And it reminds me of a quote by Sandra Dodd, where she says, "If your child is more important than your vision of your child, life will become easier."
I love that quote.
And Yeah, no, it's really good. I think sometimes we can get caught up in our own kind of perspectives, and it can get in the way of us being with our children. Going on a bit, Kim Davies, she wrote a chapter in the book called How Rude, Autism as a Study in Ability. And she picked up on how autism as a diagnostic construct was first proposed by Leo Kanner, which was in 1943. And she gave some really interesting sort of descriptions of Kanner's and Asperger's definitive sort of diagnostic publications, which really explore how the concept of autism came into existence. And Kim writes, "It's important to remember that the edifice that is autism was built upon a handful of child studies by both Kanner and Asperger. Kanner worked with 11 children and Asperger with even fewer, just 4. The children and their families were referred for clinical attention, assessment, placement and remediation by educational and other authorities, a process of ableism that continues to repeat itself in the diagnostic reflex that is such a pervasive practice in Western schooling." Kim describes the quite ordinary and understandable behaviour of the children in a very strange situation, with their behaviour under scrutiny and taken out of context, was interpreted as a sign of individual pathology. And she says, despite going on to describe in detail 4 very different children with varying backgrounds, Asperger is insistent that the school trouble these children experience can be traced to their shared pathology. Some of the behaviours Asperger described, which he thought of as evidence of autism, included Fritz V, and he said was utterly indifferent to the authority of adults. And the same boy who sat there listlessly with an absent look on his face would suddenly jump up with his eyes lit up, and before one could do anything, he would have done something mischievous. Asperger then, he described another boy called Harrow L, and he said his behaviour was problematic because of what he termed as contact disturbance, and this entailed his extremely limited relationship to his environment. Through the length of his stay on the ward, he remained a stranger. One would never see him join in a game with others. Most of the time, he sat in the corner, buried in a book, oblivious to the noise or movement around him. Such fanatical reading is rare before the age of 10. Harrow, he says, did not see the funny side of things and lacked any sense of humour, especially if the joke was on him. Kim goes on to explain that in this decontextualised situation, the children's behaviour was interpreted as a sign of pathology rather than a behaviour which could really be understood in the context of wider relational, social, economic and political context. Some of those children were struggling in school, and rather than looking at the school context to see how this might be contributing to their presentation, Asperger instead looked for something which resided in the individual child. And this focus on the child versus thinking about the wider relational setting is something which continues today when we diagnose children with autism.
Yeah, I think that you can see that in school too, right? And with unschooling, well, you know what, we're going to talk about it later, but all different kinds of labels as well, even learning difficulties, disabilities, etc. You know, when you don't consider the context and the situation, you really can get a very different message, can't you, than what's actually going on in the child's head. Okay, we should probably move on. There were a few essays that touched on systemic theory and practice that I found really interesting, because this was the first that I had heard of this term. But the description of it quickly resonated with me. Autism is viewed predominantly as an individual cognitive issue. You know, as you were saying above, it was looking to the child to explain the problem. But a systemic approach focuses on what happens between people, how they interact with one another and one another's ideas. So it's that larger picture system of people relating to each other, and in this case, when autism is part of the picture. So that means that context is the central component, and that definitely makes a lot of sense to me. Actually, just last week on the podcast, I shared one of my favorite quotes from, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now when this goes out, from Maria Popova about the difference between learning facts, the knowledge gathering that schools focus on, and understanding the context of the information and how it fits into the bigger picture, which is what unschooling values. And she defines that as wisdom. So a couple of quick quotes from Essay 12, Critical Systemic Therapy by Mark Hayden Lorlet. He wrote, with systemic therapy, there are always multiple stories that can be told about any pattern of action, and redescribing those leads to the possibility for new actions. Systemic therapists will often positively or logically relate current patterns to show that, despite unwanted outcomes, each person's behavior has logic, given an understanding of their position and context. I know we talk so often on the podcast about the value of seeing things from our child's perspective. So we see their choices and their actions from their context. And that can definitely be very different from the motivations that we might initially attribute to them. We see this so often in the Q&A questions. Listeners describe situations of unwanted outcomes, and in our discussions, we share any different patterns and underlying logic that we might see when we look at the situation that they describe through the lens of unschooling and from the child's perspective. So, what did you think about systemic therapy, Emma?
Yeah, well, I really like the ideas, and
it makes sense.
I think, I mean, systemic therapy is something that was part of my training, and I was quite fortunate about that. And I was able to sort of be part of a narrative therapy team, actually, where we sort of sat together as a team. I think Mark sort of describes it in his chapter, how you can have a conversation with another therapist at the same time, so you can reflect different perspectives. So it's not just sort of therapist and client necessarily. So you can bring in quite a rich sort of broad, like lots of different stories to the situation. So yeah, it was something that I really enjoyed reading those chapters. And I like the way that Mark and Gail Simon, who's also a family therapist, she described the importance of thinking about behaviour in the context of relationships, and also again in the context of wider social and political frameworks, which is something which is really advocated throughout the book, locating, autism, the concept of autism in a wider sort of social, political and historical framework. And thinking about really how helpful it is to explore interactions between people. And I think I really like it as well because the systemic approach, it takes a critical approach towards dominant biomedical explanations for behaviour, and it listens out for how those stories might be impacting on individuals in their lives and their families. And I think it also listens out for alternatives. So it's, being open and curious about other possibilities that might be, and other ways of sort of being, and that might be more hopeful and helpful, which I think is something that unschooling does a lot as well. I think I'm sort of thinking in terms of unschooling forums, but I guess it's really important in relationships with our children as well, that we listen out to how they're feeling and, what isn't always being said as well as what's being said. So and thinking creatively. So and I guess in some of the chapters about systemic therapy, they do emphasise, that it's a space where different stories can be told, and those stories have an impact on the way we feel about ourselves and how others feel about us. And so how we conceptualise those stories are really important. And I think that is something, again, that unschooling picks up on, is how we speak about our children, the kind of words, the language that we use, and how important that is really in terms of how we think about our relationships. And so I like that emphasis. I think there are some sort of, like you said, there's some connections here with an unschooling perspective and an approach. And Gail as well and Mark, they spoke about how to engage really in playful ways and how to create a shared experience, really. And often that can be through meeting someone where they're at and seeing things from their perspective, and also sort of tapping into their interests and their passions. And there were some nice stories in there about sort of engaging with children, as you know, through their interests, and not bringing in the therapist's agenda really, but just finding out more about the child's world and what those interests mean to them. And I think that it's really about privileging the child's experience, and that's something that we do in Unschooling.
Yeah, it was so interesting when you could see the difference when they let the child lead the conversation, right?
Yeah, it was seeing things from the child's perspective, and that kind of takes on a whole new, different meaning and allows the child to be more relaxed and open. And I think that's where there's a shared. It's a kind of term, it's called intersubjectivity, where, it's about shared experience, really. You both have a sense of connection. And I think that's what came across in those stories. It wasn't, like the therapist or adult imposing their sort of perspective on the child, but it was something that they were sort of coming to together. And it took both of them to really rethink and to connect, which I think sometimes in more traditional forms of therapy, or in a medicalised approach, it's that you're not getting those sort of shared experiences in the same way, which I think is also, as an unschooling parent, you're working together with your child really to develop those sort of shared experiences and play together and be curious together. And I think that all those things are picked up with this perspective.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that piece. So moving on, there was a couple other places that really connected for me, and I enjoyed the essays around the commodification of autism and the negative impact of labels. So let's jump into that. The commodification of, I like that word, of autism is about the big business that has developed around it. So there was an essay by Rebecca Mallett and Katherine Runswick-Cole titled "The Commodification of Autism, What's at Stake?" And quote, "Interventions and treatment programs provide a space for the exchange of valuable information for people labeled with autism and their families, and offer the quote promise of remediation, rehabilitation, and perhaps resolution in the form of a cure." Because the predominantly biomedical model of autism gives us a situation where, quote, expert professionals coherently produce autism as a thing because they perceive a need for certain behaviors and symptoms to be explained and remedied. So I see the parallels in the editors and writers of these essays, their critique of the big business of psychiatry and autism, and our unschooling critique of the big business of education. Because with conventional education, we see a narrowly defined, quote, normal of when certain skills should be learned that's laid out in curricula, and anything outside of that range is defined as abnormal, and remediation is offered by experts. You know what? When I was reading this, I just started thinking about all the tutoring businesses that have sprung up in the last few decades, like Kumon and Sylvan and Oxford Learning chains around here. And with autism, you just replace skills with behaviors, and you have a very similar picture. So I was wondering if you got that impression as well, Emma.
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation, actually, and I could really see the similarities there. And it also, that also really reminded me about Kim Davies' reflections that autism diagnosis and labelling are often used to sort of police the boundaries of what's considered to be normal and abnormal in society. And it's also an important sort of indicator of how difference can be understood and responded to. And I was thinking it's like a way of sifting and sorting and categorising people so that they fit into what the authors describe as like an agenda of a neoliberal society. And it made me think about how, in the same way, sort of grading and streaming and assessment systems in schools and the educational system might operate in a similar way, so that as an agent of the state, and in a similar way to psychiatry, how that employs autism diagnosis. So these kind of practices have a wider social and political and economic function, which can serve to maintain the status quo and may even sort of replicate or perpetuate social and structural inequalities. So the commodification of autism sort of works quite well because it's serving these wider ideals, if you like. I think it's something that John Taylor Gatto sort of picks up on as well.
Yeah.
You know, how the operation of the school system. I also was thinking about, in terms of commodification, was about there was a chapter on the biopolitics of autism in Brazil by Francisco Ortega and colleagues, and they spoke about how about their research exploring how parents in online groups are really sort of like actively sharing information and negotiating new meanings and constructing versions of autism that fit their experience. And they say consumers simultaneously consume, create, and shape meanings of the goods exchanged. So I was thinking that parents are no longer really dependent on the medical profession for information, and they can choose to access online resources. That could be sort of scientific journal articles or articles written by experts by experience, other families. And I was thinking, just as families can really define what autism means to them, that it also opens up the possibilities of people choosing to resist going down a diagnostic route. So parents sort of meeting together in online groups, they've got the opportunity to sort of talk with other parents and say, actually, I found it helpful. We decided not to go down a diagnostic route, and I'm really glad I didn't, because 4 years on, my child isn't, doesn't have any of those same issues. And I think, and they might say, if I had decided to go down a diagnostic route, then maybe it wouldn't have been like that. So I think parents have now got the opportunity to sort of collaborate together in ways perhaps they didn't have before, and they're not solely reliant on medical explanations to sort of think about their experience. So I was thinking, in terms of commodification of autism, parents can and do take an active role in deciding what's important to them, and in terms of sort of deciding, making choices. Like we have got choices that we can make, and I think this book raises some of those issues. It kind of enables us to take, reflect and think, that we don't have to feel pressure to go down a particular route. And I think that can be particularly important with unschooling, because we're outside of the usual frameworks. So there might be a bit more space to negotiate. We're not being pressured by, the school system to make those choices. I think, like you talked about before, Pam, once you left the school environment, you felt freer to actually, be in a different way. And
as you were talking about those online groups and stuff, that's right. It reminded me, 'cause I think I mentioned, I was in some online groups before as I was, doing research and trying to figure things out with the school, right? And how those, as I became more involved in the unschooling online communities, that made so much more sense. That perspective resonated so much more. And I pulled out of those more the school-oriented ones. And how they would describe labels, and how, they had to hold on to that language, right? Because that's the language they had to speak to talk with the schools. And once I found the unschooling lens and language and perspective, it made so much more sense to me that I was able to transition. So, yeah, I really love that point about parents working together and grouping together and making sense of the information that's there as it relates to their lives. Again, critical thinking and seeing what's really happening in your life versus what other people may be telling you might or should be happening, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Speaking of which, let's move into labels, because we seem to buy into labels such as, well, this was the perspective in the chapter, one of the chapters. We seem to buy into labels such as autism because they promise to take away the danger of the unknown. I was using that label to find more information, because you want to know. There's a lot of fear wrapped up in the unknown. So parents consume this information in order to understand and better care for their loved ones, and older individuals consume it to better understand themselves, right? We may even find, even as Katherine was saying, as she was finding labels for her son, she was starting to see that in herself and in her family members, etc. Because we're looking to discover what it means to have autism, to find a new set of norms, right? So, okay, this is normal because it's autism, or whatever label you're looking at. But that is normal within the specified subcategory of abnormal, right? One of the things I loved, they shared that there's an often heard phrase in the community. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Because, think about that for a second. If that's the case, then what's really the point of the label? If people labeled with autism have so little in common with one another, then the use of the label doesn't really explain much. And that whole idea led nicely into another essay, Early Diagnosis of Autism, Is Earlier Always Better, by Ginny Russell. And the conventional view is that earlier diagnosis and intervention is better. It's assumed that the younger the child, the more chances there are of succeeding with treatment. Though the literature on the effectiveness of early intervention for children with autism is far from conclusive, which the author in the essay surveys in some detail. But it also touches on the wide-ranging negative impact of labels, that lens through which everyone now views the child. So, quote, labeling theory hypothesizes that diagnosing and labeling a child as autistic will lead to shifts in expectancy and attitudes of those in contact with the child, as well as altering the self-identity of the child. And this will serve to reinforce the, quote, abnormal autistic behavior. Now, I know in my contact with the school at the time that definitely they really focused on that label and saw everything through that lens. So I definitely saw that in action. And there's so many interesting parallels with the label discussion that you and I had earlier this year when we chatted about Scott Barry Kaufman's book, Ungifted, Intelligence Redefined, and he was looking at learning disabilities. So many times I saw an overlap between those descriptions of disabilities. So I was wondering what you thought about that, Emma.
Yeah, I could see quite a lot of parallels there as well, particularly in relation to the impact that labelling has, and as a result of sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And how labels themselves, can have a really powerful effect, and what we believe to be true about ourselves and what others believe to be true about us can have quite a profound influence on our behaviour and how we go on to develop, really. And I think that's some of the issues that Ginny, as you mentioned, sort of picks up in this chapter, and that we should be cautious about proceeding with diagnosis and labelling from an early age, because we don't really know yet, the consequences of young children and even older children having that label. Ginny describes how there isn't enough research done yet, really, to tell us how they will go on to develop as a result of that. And what she does explain in the chapter, she mentions how once children have been diagnosed, it can lead to a change in attitude from others, and they might have lower expectations. They might sort of disengage or feel that they can't, that they don't know how to relate to the child anymore, because they don't feel like they have enough expertise or knowledge. So it can create kind of a state of alienation. And she describes really how once you've made that sort of diagnosis, then all behaviour can be sort of really tends to be thought about, or can be, in terms of sort of like a biomedical explanation, which you touched upon above it, with the school having the sort of kind of a narrow tunnel vision, and that can, it's how that can really prevent you from understanding what's actually really happening for the child, and from seeing anything else. Ginny, you mentioned about the research that she talks about, and I wanted to pull out a couple of bits. I thought they were quite interesting. She mentions that 30% of children who are given an autism diagnosis at age 2 no longer meet the criteria for the autism diagnosis at age 4. Now, I thought that was quite a significant, piece of research, and in terms of sort of it's suggesting that just because we've identified a child as having particular symptoms at a certain age, that they might not have that as they get older. And children change so much developmentally during those years that I do find it astonishing that they are diagnosing children actually really young. And Ginny's done some research herself, which has looked at 2 groups of children who had severe autistic type traits, and they were measured at the age of 2. And one group received an autism diagnosis later on, but the children that didn't receive an autism diagnosis, they actually went on to have better outcomes as adolescents. So it's actually suggesting that sometimes actually it's better to wait and see what happens rather than to jump in and to sort of go down a diagnostic route, because if you can, the children actually did improve in terms of those sort of initial behaviours over time without any intervention. So I thought they were really interesting studies that she cited there, and it also challenges us to reconsider. I mean, traditionally autism is known as a sort of like a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's considered to be like a lifelong impairment. And I think Katherine described in the first chapter how devastated she felt when she was given the diagnosis, and she was given some statistics that that it's a lifelong like condition, and that her child may not live alone, they might always be dependent. It was quite a bleak outlook that she was given, and I think in this chapter, sort of Ginny saying that we don't really know that that's the case, and actually it seems like children actually do do go on to sort of like have good outcomes in adolescence without intervention. So, and Ginny says sort of when interventions are not proven and when iatrogenic effects of labelling are not disproven, the benefits of early intervention paradigm for childhood developmental disorders should really be questioned, at least until there is enough concrete evidence of real benefit. And I think that's an important point that she's making. So, and I did happen to meet Ginny a little while ago, and she's working at Exeter University in the UK, and she's actually doing a current research project which is actually looking at the impact of diagnosis and labelling in relation to autism and the neurodiversity movement. So I think that's some really interesting, and she's quite welcoming of people getting in touch with her to sort of share their experiences, and she's interested in collaborating with people about that.
Oh wow, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, no, it was a really interesting to think about. Because I love that. That's, the point of so many of these essays is just to question, that to show that there are questions in the conventional paradigm, right? So, that's something we as unschooling parents are used to considering. They're not saying yes, no, they're not demanding one way or the other, but they're saying, hey, there's some information out here, there's experiences with other parents, and, there are questions around here that are worth discussion. That's really interesting. So speaking of, there was an essay titled Schools Without Labels, which was written by Nick Hodge. And Nick has an interesting backstory. He was a teacher of children with special education needs and disabilities for 15 years before becoming a university-based academic with a specialism in autism. So when he was studying for his doctorate, he began questioning many of the canons of special ed that he had previously accepted without question, like the idea that diagnosis and labeling is always in a child's best interest. So after his 15 years as a teacher, in his 17 years of work as an academic, he's encouraged students to adopt a more critical engagement with labels and to consider their value and impact. So his experience is that, quote, students are reluctant initially to give up the meanings of labels that they are accustomed to, because they've built an identity around it. And parents have fought hard to secure a diagnosis for their child and so have invested heavily in this being an enabling act. They're helping them. They're doing this to help them. It's their key to get resources for their child. But in the essay, he questions whether these labels have more negative impact instead. He makes the point that, quote, the mystique of medical terminology that surrounds a diagnosis creates an authority for the assignment to children of the devalued status of deviant, disordered, different, or special, meaning these are children whom only doctors can understand and make better. Parents and non-medical practitioners become hesitant and uncertain as to whether they are able to support such a child without the expert knowledge of the particular syndrome that medical professionals assert they have. You alluded to this a little bit earlier, because parents can end up minimizing their experience and knowledge of their own child and stop engaging with them from that space of intimate connection because they feel like they don't have that expert knowledge. So the label becomes the totality of the child's social identity. Because we were talking earlier about seeing the different stories where teachers tend to use a child's label to explain a child's, say, lack of learning. Some disabled students offer alternative perspectives, like the lessons were boring, teachers didn't understand their needs, other pupils were messing about in the class, or feeling that no one expects them to do well, so why put in the effort? He makes the point that resistance to labeling is not a call for an abandonment of assessment. These are different things. It is vital that we come to know who children are, what they enjoy, fear, their hopes and aspirations for the future, their worries and concerns, what motivates them, and what turns them away from learning. And he's describing right there exactly what unschooling parents do. We come to know who our children are. And one of the messages that came up a number of times throughout the essays, and that fits well with what so many unschooling parents has found, is that if you focus on the child's individual needs, their strengths and their weaknesses, there is little value to having the label. It doesn't add anything else on top because you're already at the root. So is there anything else that stood out for you, Emma, about labeling?
Well, yeah, picking up on what you just said as well about, resistance to labelling is not a call for abandonment of assessment. I think that's a really important point. And also, if a parent and child is struggling, I think it can also be important to seek support and help with that. So I don't think anyone's saying that, don't get support. We're saying that maybe it could be helpful to reach out. For example, like the systemic therapeutic work that was described in the book, I think that could actually be really valuable, just to open up new conversations within a family if they are struggling with issues and they feel that that they need to have support with it. Mm-hmm. And there's other approaches as well that I've sort of come across recently. For example, like TheraPlay, for example, which is another approach that's really non-pathologizing, and it works on sort of like strengthening relationship between parents and the parent and the child. Or there's another approach called video interactive guidance, which again looks at increasing the connection, and it looks to do that through sort of shared interests and being playful together and increasing the connection. So I think that there are a sort of like a number of options that you can sort of take up, because I think some parents may get into a situation where they don't go for help because they don't want to feel that they're sort of going down a diagnostic route. but there are options, like non-pathologizing options available. But I think you do have to do your research in terms of finding a therapist, and you need to sort of speak to them first and really kind of find out what kind of position they're taking on this before you engage with with therapy. But that goes back to the kind of critical thinking as well, and being reflective.
And taking your child's perspective, right? If that's something that your child wants to pursue, right?
Yeah.
Or at least is interested. Because you don't want to be forcing them.
No, definitely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I think some of the approaches described here are very sort of child-friendly, and they do sort of take the child's perspective into account. So if the child was interested, they might find that it's actually a positive experience. Hopefully the therapist might be playful and engage them in things that they're interested in, and really come at things from their perspective, which I think could be helpful if they were interested in doing that. And it isn't seeing it as the child's sort of difficulty. It's sort of thinking about the relationships in the family, and how to sort of improve that, really, and how to better support each other, I guess. So, I liked Nick's chapter as well, and his approach to labelling, and I really picked up on how it can sometimes be like a double-edged sword, that you can have the both negative and the positive aspects of it. So it might give you access to certain benefits, like, certain services, or, like a community of people that you might feel that you can trust. But they also acknowledge that some of these things don't always come to fruition in terms of services, that often families are left without the support that they expected, when they engage with the service. So, and Dan Goodley says that, the biopolitics of autism are that as soon as they give with one hand, they threaten to take away with another. So there's pros and cons, which I suppose if as parents, it's something that they have to navigate. And as unschooling parents, we do have the potential to sort of choose not to choose to resist it, I guess. And in terms of labelling, Sami Timimi, he's done a really interesting talk which explores these issues in more depth about labelling. It's called Autism, Do Labels Help or Hinder? And that's available on YouTube.
Oh, excellent. I'd be interested in that. I'll definitely put the link to that in the show notes as well. So just to wrap up, I think one of my favorite questions that was raised in the book was in the essay, The Ethics and Consequences of Making Autism Spectrum Disorder Diagnoses by Saqib Latif. And I hope I pronounced that properly. The most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, now defines autism as one big spectrum, just autism spectrum disorder, without any of the subdivisions that were in the fourth edition. He writes, there is no dispute about the existence of ASD behaviors. Instead, the dispute is about whether these behaviors amount to a discrete, naturally occurring category that the diagnostic label represents. Is it fair, necessary, or useful to reduce down to a one-dimensional construct of ASD the evolving personality, experiences, diverse histories, and contexts of a growing child with a highly plastic brain? Human behavior involves social and moral dimensions and cannot be understood without taking into consideration the values of that individual, their family, and indeed their broader cultural milieu. One wonders, given that there is such a massive variation, whether it should be called a disorder spectrum or just a human spectrum. And that really connected with me because, that basically outlines my journey. And how I got to that point. So I really enjoyed that piece. That kind of gave me goosebumps there. But I thought that was a really interesting book, and I thank you so much for recommending it. It was really fascinating reading and lots of interesting questions to ponder, and that's kind of my favorite thing to do, is to dig in. And it was fun to see the parallels and the connections with unschooling as well, because I was surprised how deeply I saw them relating to one another, the kinds of questions that they raised. So was there anything you would like to say to wrap up?
No, just thanks for, discussing the book. I thought it's a really important book to talk about, and, I think it's opening up spaces for new conversations about these issues, and I think hopefully it'll be helpful to families, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. I really, really appreciate all the time and effort that you put into these episodes. I love chatting about this stuff with you. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Okay, thanks, Pam. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes at livingjoyfully.ca/podcast. While you're there, be sure to check out the second book in my Living Joyfully with Unschooling series, Free to Live, Create a Thriving Unschooling Home. In it, I dive into the 4 characteristics that I found helped unschooling flourish in our home: curiosity, patience, strong relationships, and trust. One reviewer wrote, "Really enjoyed this short and sweet book. It has marvelous one-liners, and though I'm not an underliner, I found myself underlining on every page." Another said, "I believe it would benefit any homeschooler or parent to read this book, as it re-emphasizes the importance of the relationship between a parent and a child in the learning process. I plan to reread this book. It is rich and full of gems. Give yourself some time to absorb it before rushing into unschooling." Until next time, have fun living and learning with your family.